Today we're going to be talking about the wonders that come from loving the Lord and the woes that come from loving the world. My name is David Tate. This is Now Let's Be Honest, and this is part 5 in our series walking through the Old Testament prophets, where we're slowly but surely working our way all the way from the book of Isaiah, Lord willing, to the book of Malachi. There's many reasons why I think we should be doing this study, the primary one being that we don't study these books enough. As Christians, we spend most of our time in the New Testament, and when we're in the Old Testament, we probably spend the least amount of time in the prophets. But through studying these books, I have learned to love God more, to love his people more, and also to revere God and really focus on the things that I think that he wants us to focus on. And so I think that this is a really good study. I hope that it will bless you as much as it has blessed me, and that's why we're doing this study. I do want to let you know that I have created a bunch of PowerPoints for this, as you'll see as we go through these videos, and if you want access to those PowerPoints, I do have those available in the links in the description down below, or if you go to nowletsbehonest.com/resources. nowletsbehonest.com/resources. If you go there, you can access all of the PowerPoints I've made absolutely for free. You can just click them, you can download them. I will be updating those as we go through this series, and so if you're wanting the new stuff, just keep checking in every week, and I will hopefully be updating that as we go, and I want those to be absolutely free for y'all. One other quick announcement is that I did finally launch my Patreon page, and you can access that once again by going down into the link in the descriptions down below. I was kind of hesitant to do this because I'm not really a big fan of asking for money, and it's really not my plan to ask for money because I really don't like doing that. It makes me uncomfortable, and I don't know, whenever people start getting money involved with stuff, they start getting weird, and I don't want to do that. But I did have people reaching out to me asking for ways to support my channel and to support me, and I appreciated that, and so I set up the Patreon page. And so I did want to give a quick shout out to my first 5 patrons, Savannah Barrett, S. Chan, Sharon Spencer, Tawana Thornton, and Ben Raboin or Raboin. I'm not sure how to pronounce that last name, but it's a really cool one. So Ben Raboin, I like your last name. That's cool. But thank you so much for supporting this channel, and if you want to support this channel, you can feel free to do that. Just go into the description down below, and I do have that accessible to you. I've got 3 different tiers I've set up with different benefits you can get from each one, just so that you're not just doing it and not getting anything back. But yeah, so thank you so much for those of y'all who've reached out and asked for that. I don't like asking for money, but I appreciate your thoughtfulness and your care and your love in wanting to do that. But that being said, I've talked long enough, and we need to get to this study, so I'm going to pray for us real quick, and then we are going to jump into Isaiah chapter 5. Dear Lord, thank you so much for allowing us to gather here right now to study your word. Thank you for giving us your word, God. I think sometimes we take that for granted. There's a lot of people who, the majority of Christians through the majority of time, did not even have their own personal Bibles. Yet we have the freedom not only to have access to our own personal Bibles to study each and every day, but we also get to gather together freely with other believers, and we get to talk about the scriptures, and we get to exalt you together. And that's a freedom that we don't want to take for granted, God. And so as we go into your word, let us recognize the grace that you showed us even in giving it in the first place. And let us go into studying it with an air of reverence and respect, with our eyes set on you and your glory, and really just going about this in a sober-minded way that is entirely focused on you, God. We love you, God. We thank you for everything that you have done, you are doing, and you will do. Let's not take that for granted, but let us set aside all distractions and really just focus on you during this time. It's in your name we pray. Amen. All right, so today we are going to be doing Isaiah chapter 5, which I have titled The Song of the Vineyard. If you remember, I'm a big context person, so I'm going to give us a little bit of context on what we've been covering so far. In Isaiah chapter 1, the prophet gave us a brief introduction to the whole book as a whole, right? He was just telling us what this book's going to be about, and it had to do with a lot of calling people out for their sin. In Isaiah chapters 2 through 4, we actually got to zoom in a little bit more, and Isaiah started giving us a little bit more in-depth view of what the people of Judah, the southern kingdom of Judah, what they were doing at this time period that was so heinous and so bad. Isaiah chapter 5 is actually going to pick up right where chapter 4 left off. Really, Isaiah chapters 2 through 5 are kind of like one contained little unit. I just split it up because I wanted to go a little bit more in depth into this chapter than we did on the previous 3. And this one goes a little bit more in depth, continuing to lay out the issues that are going on with the people of Judah at that time period. And I think there's a lot that we can learn as Christians even nowadays, because I think we're guilty of a lot of the same stuff. And so, that being said, Isaiah chapter 5, the Song of the Vineyard. Let's hop right in. Verse 1. Let me sing for my beloved, my love song concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He dug it and cleared it of stones and planted it with choice vines. He built a watchtower in the midst of it and hewed out a wine vat in it. And he looked for it to yield grapes, but it yielded wild grapes. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it? When I looked for it to yield grapes, why did it yield wild grapes? And now I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it shall be devoured. I will break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down. I will make it a waste. It shall not be pruned or hoed, and briars and thorns shall grow up. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain upon it. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are his pleasant planting. And he looked for justice, but behold, bloodshed. For righteousness, but behold, an outcry. And I'm going to go back to verse 1, but I wanted to read all of that together because that right there is the song. After verse 7, we're actually going to move into a series of things which are called the Six Woes against the people of Judah, right? You can see this. I have the outline on the right side of the screen here, just giving you an outline of this whole chapter. But these first 7 verses is the song that kind of contextualizes the rest of the chapter. And what we see here is that this song is a love song from the prophet Isaiah to God. He is singing a song about how much he loves God, but dramatically and interestingly enough, the song is not a happy song. It's a heartbreaking song. It's almost like those country songs, which are love songs, but they're always inevitably sad. That's kind of how this song is, because Isaiah is singing to the God who he loves, the God who he adores, the God who has done everything for him and his people. But at the same time, it's a song of unrequited love. It's a song about how much God has loved and lavished gifts upon his people, but how much they've rejected him and have not given him the love that he deserved. And so it is a song about love, but unfortunately it's not a song about reciprocated love. It's a song about heartbreak, a song about heartache. It's a song about this great big God who loves his people so much, yet for some reason they refuse to love him back. That is the sad part of this song. That's really what we're going to see. Next week, we're going to be going through Isaiah chapter 6, which is covering the call of Isaiah. And we're going to see that that's why Isaiah's content is often so depressing, is because whenever God called him into ministry, he was calling him to a very depressing task, because the people of Judah at this time period are very, very rebellious. They're refusing to listen to God. And so we shouldn't be surprised whenever we read this love song and it ends in heartache, because that's just the state of the people at this time period. And whenever Isaiah is called into ministry, that's what God calls him to minister to. He's being called to minister to a rebellious people who refuse to love God back. And so let's walk through this. Let me sing for my beloved, my love song concerning his vineyard. Right? So right off the bat, Isaiah is singing about God. And the way you can tell this is as we go through the song, it's going to be very clear that the beloved is talking about God and the vineyard is talking about Judah, because he's going to expressly state that in the verses to come. So he's saying, let me sing for my beloved. I like that Isaiah calls him my beloved, because it shows that although the people of Judah have turned away from God, not every single person in Judah had done so. Isaiah is the prime example of that. He still loved God, and he's singing this song for God. But it's the love song concerning his vineyard. What he's going to do over the course of this song is he is going to compare the people of Judah to a vineyard. And I don't know about you, but I don't live in a agricultural society where we have vineyards everywhere. And so what I did is I actually included a picture right here on the bottom of the screen that depicts what a vineyard would have looked like in the land of Israel at this time period. This is actually an archaeological, discovered, excavated site that is a vineyard, exactly like the one being described here in the verses to come. And so this is what we can picture as Isaiah sings this song. So he says, let me sing for my beloved, my love song concerning his vineyard. My beloved, once again, God, he had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. So we have God who has this vineyard, right? The people of Judah, and he places them on a very fertile hill, right? So God, I'm trying to think how to say this. Okay. The land of Israel is a much coveted land. There's a reason why the people of Israel have not encountered a lot of peace over the thousands of years of their existence, and that's because it is on this narrow strip of land in between water and desert that connects 3 different continents together. So everybody wants this land called Israel, the land of Canaan, the land of Palestine, right? Everybody wants this land. And so God placed this vineyard on a very fertile hill. He gave them the most desirable land that everybody wants. Because you can't get, like, if you're wanting to get from Europe to Africa, if you want to get from Asia to Africa, you have to go through this land, especially back in those days. Nowadays, we have planes and everything. Back then, if you're traveling by foot, you either had to get in a boat and you had to go through the water, which is more dangerous, or you had to go through the desert, or you could go through the land of Israel. So God put them in the choicest of all lands. He placed them on a very fertile hill. And Mount Zion, Jerusalem, it is set on the most majestic of hills where so many things have been done by God here. He dug it, and he cleared it of stones and planted it with choice vines. You can see this in this picture right here. You can see how at that time, whenever people would make vineyards, what they do is they'd clear away the stones, and they'd often use these stones as supporting walls in order to clear the way and to give support to this vineyard and to make it look beautiful. That's what God did. He dug it. He cleared it of stones. He planted it with choice vines. He built a watchtower in the midst of it. You can see the watchtower in the center of this picture here, right? God made this watchtower for the people of Israel, right? So the image, I'm going to try to explain this parable. It's kind of a parable. That's what it is. It's a mixture of a parable and an analogy. And as Isaiah is describing this, he's describing God's history with the people of Israel, with the people of Judah. Not only did God create them, and not only did he give them the choicest of lands, but he dug it and cleared it of stones and planted it with choice vines. Throughout all their history, God has been the one preparing them, taking care of them. He is the one who sent them to Egypt so that they could populate, and he is the one who took them out of Egypt. He is the one who brought them through successfully into the land of Canaan, who planted them there, who made them clear away all the people, and who helped them clear away all the people. He's the one who gave them all these kings to lead them and take care of them. And then he built a watchtower in the midst of it. He sent them prophets to call them out on their sin and to watch over them and to watch out for all the foreign enemies who might come to oppress them. God has been taking care of these people constantly, and he hewed out a wine vat in it, and he looked for it to yield grapes. Right? So now we get to this, if we're progressing the story further, we have this vineyard owner who has this amazing vineyard, and he has done everything he can possibly do to ensure that this vineyard is successful. He is the one who created, and he put it in the place where it should be. It's on a fertile hill, right? He put it in the place where it should be successful, right? He didn't put it in the midst of a desert. It's in a place where it should be successful. And then he tended to it, and he cared for it, and he gave them every reason to be successful. And he looked for it to yield grapes, expecting it to yield something good, but it yielded wild grapes. And so what Isaiah is saying in this love song for God is he is saying that God has done everything to take care of his people. God has poured himself out. He has done every possible thing to make sure that his people are walking in obedience to him, to make sure they are as successful as possible. He has done everything so that they have no reason to be anything but blessed. But instead, whenever he looks at the fruit of their labor, and whenever he goes down to them to see what they have done and what they have produced, he sees that they have produced bad grapes that are inedible. So right here I have this little note. The owner formed, prepared, tended, protected, and equipped the vineyard, yet despite his effort, it produced only bad, inedible fruit. That is what God's relationship is to the people of Judah right now. He did everything for them. He gave them no reason to be anything but successful. Yet now whenever he looks at them, he faces nothing but disappointment. They should have yielded good grapes that were great for making the best of wine, but instead they produced only that which should be thrown away. It's inedible. He doesn't want it. It would just make someone's stomach curdle. It would make somebody get sick. That's how God feels about the people of Judah right now. They should be doing amazing things. They were supposed to be a holy nation, set apart to be a light amongst the Gentiles, so that people looked to them and said, we want to serve that God. But the issue is that even the people of God are not serving that God. And so God looks to them, and they've gone astray, and it breaks his heart. And that is the love song that Isaiah is singing to God, because he recognizes God's severe love for his people, but he also recognizes that they are not returning that love, and instead they are producing the exact opposite of what they have reason to produce. And then he continues. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. Right now it seems like it's God speaking here, and he's talking to the people of Jerusalem and Judah. Keep in mind that this is a continuation of the same prophecy that started in Isaiah chapter 2, where God is speaking through Isaiah specifically to the people of Judah and Jerusalem, to the southern kingdom. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. So God's calling everybody. He's calling the people themselves up to the stand. And he's saying, okay, guys, you tell me, who's at fault here? God or his people? Me or you? What more was there for me? What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it? When I looked for it to yield grapes, why did it yield wild grapes? So God is calling his people up, and he's saying, judge between us. Who's the one at fault here? Me or you? God's saying, I did everything to make sure that you walked in obedience. I gave you a law. I gave you 613 commands. The first one, which says, you shall love the Lord. Well, the greatest one says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. The first command, it says, hey, guess what? You shall have no other gods before me. He made it very clear what his goals were for them. He gave them every reason to be obedient. Yet now when he looks at them, they're walking in disobedience, and he says, okay, who's at fault? I think this is something that is very applicable to us nowadays. Because I think as Christians, first off, we're still sinners, right? We're not perfect. And so I think there's a very clear way that this applies to us. But also we see this happening whenever people talk about the problem of evil. And people say, why is there evil in the world? Why is there sin in the world? Why does God allow bad things to happen? Well, I think this is how God would respond. He would say, judge between me and you. Who's the one at fault here? Is God the one responsible for evil, or is it a result of man's sin? Yes, there are some things that happen that aren't directly a result of man's sin, but we have to remember that the ground and the earth was cursed because of man's sin. And so the existence of evil in the world is not the fault of God, it's the fault of man. And so if there's bad things that happen, it's because that is the just judgment of a gracious and loving God. And so I think there is a very clear application for us nowadays because people are so quick to accuse God of evil and to accuse God of bad. But whenever you actually look at the history of God with mankind, there's nothing that holds him guilty because he has done nothing but love us and care for us and cherish us and graciously reprove us and graciously pursue us. That's what God has been doing. Yet for some reason, people want to accuse him of evil whenever it's very evident that we are the ones who are guilty. And so I think just as God is saying that Judah is the one guilty here, we have to take that as our own fault as well, right? Yes, there are bad things that happen, but it's not God's fault. God has allowed it to happen, but that's because he allowed us to choose sin. And he's not going to force us into a relationship with him if we don't want to be in that relationship. And so God says, judge between me and my vineyard. He's talking specifically about him and his people, right? So not just him and the people at large, him and specifically the people he called to serve him. And so this becomes especially important whenever you think about us, like God in the church. There's a lot of issues in the modern church nowadays where people are going through this cultural Christianity or progressive Christianity stuff, where people are totally turning away from God. And I think God would say the same thing, judge between me and you. Who's at fault here? Did God change? Did God move? No. We're the ones at fault. We're the ones who changed. We're the ones that moved. And so I think we have to constantly remind ourselves, God is faultless. God is good. God is all-powerful. He's not going to be the one changing. If somebody has changed, it's us. It reminds me of the Hank Williams song, Why Don't You Love Me Like You Used to Do? One of us has changed, so let me give you a clue. Why don't you love me like you used to do? God has not ceased loving his people. So if the love is not quite the same, and if somebody's changed, it's us who has moved away from him, not him who's moved away from us. So we need to remember that. That's exactly what God's saying to the people of Judah. He's saying, hey, I gave you every reason to love me because I've done nothing but love you. Yet you've rejected me and you've produced the opposite of what you were meant to produce. And now I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it shall be devoured. I will break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down. I will make it a waste. It shall not be pruned or hoed, and briars and thorns shall grow up. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain upon it. So this is what God says in response to his people's disobedience. He says that as Judah's punishment for failing to respond properly to God, he will remove his sovereign hand of protection over them, making them vulnerable to foreign invasion, and will allow the land to lie desolate. He says, okay, well, out of my love for you, what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove my protection. This sounds sad and it sounds a little bit unloving, but if you've ever been a parent, I think you'll understand this. Whenever your child is growing up, I don't have any children, but I've seen this happen. And it makes sense. Whenever you have a child and he makes a mistake, whenever he's young, it's kind of cute. You're like, okay, you didn't know any better. But then as he continues to make the same mistakes and as he continues to get older, it gets less cute and it becomes overtly disobedient. And eventually, it's no longer ha ha ha, that was cute. Now it's like, hey, you need to stop doing that. And if they continue to do it, you start punishing them. And eventually the child gets to such a state where you have to realize, okay, I am actually hurting them by not reproving them more. And so as a parent, you might have to say, son, I have helped you out of this situation enough. You have to fend for yourselves. I've seen this happen plenty of times with people who are drug addicts, right? I mean, their parents will help them out and they care for them and they love them so much and they will take them in and they'll say, okay, I understand. And they'll kind of just like treat them like a little baby and they'll say, okay, we don't want to do that again. But then at some point, their child's in prison or their child's in jail and they're saying, you got to get yourself out of the situation. Because they realize that by constantly helping them out, they are actually allowing these people to justify, continue living in sin because they always know that they have someone they can return to and count on. And so God's doing the same thing. He's making the hard decision that a parent has to make. And he says, I've taken care of you. I've given you no reason to be disobedient, but now I've had it. At this point, it's no longer cute that you're being disobedient, and it's no longer enough for me to just slightly judge you. Now I've got to remove my protection from you, and you've got to try to fend for yourself and see how you like it. Because then once they have to fend for themselves and they realize that they're not equipped to do so, they'll come running back to God. And so keep in mind that God has the end game in mind here, right? He's thinking long term. He knows that this is what must happen if his people are going to return to him. But it's a very hard decision in the moment. So he says, I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge and it shall be devoured. I will break down its wall and it shall be trampled down. So God's saying, I gave this hedge of protection around the people of Judah. And I made it so that even if enemies oppressed them, they would never be able to overtake them. But I'm taking that hedge away and it will be devoured. There was a wall around Jerusalem, but God says, I'm going to allow that wall to be broken down and I myself am going to break it down and it shall be trampled down. This is exactly what we're going to see. Eventually, after the people come back from captivity, they're going to have to rebuild this wall. So God isn't just speaking metaphorically, he's speaking literally. I will make it a waste. It shall not be pruned or hoed, and briars and thorns shall grow up. So right now, they're living in this fertile land where they enjoy peace and prosperity. But the time will come when nobody will be taking care of the land because everybody's going to be sent away. And so the land is going to become desolate. It's going to become a waste. It seems like a wasted opportunity, right? He gave them this fertile land, and it was fertile before they got there. But now, in their absence, it's going to become an absolute waste. We see that God gave them something good, but because they didn't appreciate it and they didn't respond in gratitude, he's going to send them away. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain upon it. So God says, I'm going to send a famine. I'm going to make it so that even I am not taking care of the land in their absence, right? Because they're not there to take care of it. But maybe if the rain rains, well, maybe the land will stay fertile. He says, nope, I'm going to command the clouds that they rain no rain upon it. And then this is where Isaiah explains the song. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel. So he clarifies that the Lord of hosts, that is his beloved, right? Yahweh with angel armies. That's what Lord of hosts means. And the vineyard is the house of Israel. It's the men of Judah. There's pleasant planting. He put them there. He's the one who took care of them. And he looked for justice, but behold bloodshed. For righteousness, but behold an outcry. There's a play of words in the Hebrew here that I wanted to draw out. So what it literally says in Hebrew, it says, and he looked for mishpat, but behold mispach. He looked for tzedakah, but behold tzedakah. Right? So the words are very similar. And so it's like, you were close, but not close at all. It looks the same. It looks like you're doing the right thing, but it's actually the exact opposite, right? Mishpat versus mispach. Tzedakah versus tzedakah, right? One people, they've suggested that this is a way that you could do it to where you kind of capture the same thing in English. He looked for equity, but behold iniquity. For right, but behold a riot. So God goes and he looks for these good grapes in his vineyard. He looks for the people to do the right thing. But behold, rather than doing the right thing and rather than giving justice and equity, instead he finds only sin and iniquity. These people are doing the exact opposite of what they're doing, but by all outward appearances, they're claiming to do the same thing, right? Oh yeah, we do equity. No, you don't. You do iniquity. It sounds the same, but it's not. Yeah, we do what's right. No, you don't. You just have riots and you're like everybody's just rioting because they're freaking out, right? He goes there and he's looking for righteousness. He's looking for people who are doing the right thing so that everybody's in peace and prosperity. But instead, there's an outcry because people are saying the enemy is coming. The enemy is coming. That's what God finds when he goes to his vineyard. They should have had good grapes, but instead they had bad grapes. Real quick, before we moved on to the rest of this, and we're going to go a little bit faster through the rest of the chapter. I wanted to spend a long time on this because this contextualizes the rest of the chapter, and it really kind of conveys the heart of Isaiah's message. But before we do that, I wanted to point out that Jesus himself seems to allude to this exact parable in Isaiah in one of his own parables. And this is what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 21. You can also read about this in Mark chapter 12 and Luke chapter 20. Jesus says, "Hear another parable. There was a master of a house who planted a vineyard and put a fence around it, and dug a winepress in it, and built a tower and leased it to tenants, and went into another country." So you can see how he sets up this parable in the exact same way as Isaiah's. "When the season for fruit drew near, he sent his servants to the tenants to get his fruit. And the tenants took his servants and beat one, killed another, and stoned another. Again he sent other servants more than the first, and they did the same to them. Finally he sent his son to them, saying, 'They will respect my son.' But when the tenants saw the son, they said to themselves, 'This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and have his inheritance.' And they took him and threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. When therefore the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants?' They said to him, 'He will put those wretches to a miserable death and let out the vineyard to other tenants who will give him the fruits in their seasons.'" So what Jesus is talking about in this parable is he's talking about the same vineyard that Isaiah is talking about here, right? God had his people, his vineyard. And what he did is he sent various servants to call them out and take care of that vineyard. What Jesus is talking about is the prophets. Isaiah would be one of these servants. But the cruel twist is that the people, whenever they receive these servants, they kill them. And they destroy them, and they run them off. And that's exactly what the people are going to do to the prophets. Isaiah has this message of repentance and love for the people, but they're going to ultimately reject him, and we're going to spend some time talking about that in the next week whenever we go through his calling. The people are going to reject the prophets. That's the sad part. And so finally, at the conclusion of this, Jesus says, okay, the vineyard owner says, "I will send my son." Maybe they'll respect him, but what they're going to do is that they're going to kill him. And that's exactly what they're going to do to Jesus. Jesus is going to be the vineyard owner's son who finally comes to check in on the vineyard. And he's ultimately going to be killed. And so Jesus says, what is this owner going to do? And he says, and they say, "He will put those wretches to a miserable death and let out the vineyard to other tenants who will give him the fruits in their seasons." And that's exactly what we're going to see in the New Testament, right? The Jews, they're going to kill Jesus. And so what is the owner of the house the vineyard going to do? Well, he's going to take the gospel to the Gentiles. He's going to deny the Jews at large. I mean, obviously there's going to be faithful Jews who do come to Christ, and that's how the whole church starts. But by and large, the gospel is going to go to the Gentiles. He's going to give it to somebody who will appreciate his message. But that doesn't mean that he's forsaking the Jews. And ultimately, the Bible makes it clear that God does still have a plan for the Jewish people. But for a time period at least, the vineyard is going to be given out to somebody else who will actually appreciate it. Verse 42, Jesus said to them, "Have you never read in the scriptures, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone? This was the Lord's doing, and it was marvelous in our eyes. Therefore I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people producing its fruits. And the one who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, and when it falls on anyone, it will crush him." When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, they perceived that he was speaking about them. And although they were seeking to arrest him, they feared the crowds because they held him to be a prophet. And so the chief priests and Pharisees, they hear these parables and they realize it's about them. But ironically, this parable is not original to Jesus. It's actually from the book of Isaiah. And so the Pharisees and scribes, they hear what Jesus is saying and they're like, ooh, Jesus is calling us the people who led people into exile back in Isaiah's time period. Because Isaiah is saying in this love song, he is saying that these people are the ones responsible for all of Judah going into exile. Because these people refuse to acknowledge God, because they refuse to give God the glory to his name, because they claim to live for God, but really produce the opposite, because they claim to live for equity, but they produce iniquity, because they claim to do what's right, but only produce riots, the people will go off into exile. And Jesus, stumbled over my words there. And Jesus is saying that that's who the Pharisees and scribes are. They are the same people. They are doing the exact same thing. The people killed the prophets back in their day. And now the Pharisees and scribes are going to kill Jesus, the son of the vineyard owner. Now let's move on, and let's go into the rest of this chapter, where we're going to have 6 woes directed against the people of Judah. This is where Isaiah is going to get really specific, and he's going to start talking about the specific things that the people are guilty of. We talked a little bit about this last week, where we talked about things like materialism, and we talked about idolatry and stuff like that. And this is even more specific. You can see how Isaiah is slowly pinpointing who's at fault with all this stuff. And so there's 6 different woes, and the way that we have those is every phrase is going to start with the word woe. Woe, like that's a bad thing, right? Okay. The first woe, verses 8 through 10, is directed against greedy materialists. And this is what Isaiah has to say. Woe to those who join house to house, who add field to field until there is no more room, and you are made to dwell alone in the midst of the land. The Lord of hosts has sworn in my hearing, surely many houses shall be made desolate, large and beautiful houses without inhabitant. For 10 acres a vineyard shall yield but 1 bath, and a homer of seed shall yield but 1 ephah. All right, so let's break this down. First off, woe to those who join house to house, who add field to field until there is no more room, and you are made to dwell alone in the midst of the land. Right here, I have a note that says there is nothing inherently wrong with acquiring possessions, but doing so in order to flaunt one's wealth or achieve satisfaction is greedy and sinful, distracting one's heart from God and often coming at the expense of another who is less wealthy. That's exactly what you see being described right here. Woe to those who join house to house, who add field to field. These people don't need these extra houses. They're just doing it because they can. They don't need these extra fields to provide for themselves. They're just doing it because they have the money to do so. Until there is no more room, and you are made to dwell alone in the midst of the land. The imagery is that these people are getting so rich, and they're adding so many houses, adding so many fields, that eventually they have such large property that they're left all alone. Because they don't have any neighbors, because they've run the neighbors out in order that they can acquire more things. And so you actually have the irony of wealth being brought into the forefront here, right? These people, they're acquiring so much, but they're losing the things that really matter. They acquire all the possessions, but they're losing the intimacy of personal relationships because they're actually wronging all these other people, and they're making people poor by their own poverty, by their own wealth. They're driving people to poverty by their own wealth. Isaiah says this is bad, but you have people in Judah who are doing this. According to the law, these people are supposed to care for the poor. And if you see your brother who is poor and you've got money to help them out, you should do it out of love and care for your brother. But these people instead, they're so focused on their own personal gain and their own personal wealth that they're adding house to house, field to field, until eventually they have so much property and they've deprived other people of property and house. But now they're left all alone in the midst of the land. They have nobody to share it with. It's kind of sad. The Lord of hosts has sworn in my hearing, surely many houses shall be desolate, large and beautiful houses without inhabitant. So this is once again looking forward to that day when the people will be taken off into exile. You have all these houses and you have all these fields, but guess what? All that's going to amount to is empty houses and empty fields, because you're not going to live there long, because eventually the Babylonians are going to come in, they're going to take you captive, and all that stuff you acquire, it's going to be for nothing because you can't take it with you. For 10 acres of vineyard shall yield but 1 bath, and a homer of seed shall yield but an ephah. These are measurements that are very foreign to us nowadays, and so what I did is I included a description over on the right that explains what these are. The phrase for 10 acres here, it literally means, in Hebrew, it means 10 yoke. And a yoke is the amount of land a pair of oxen can plow in a single day, and so it's talking about how there are 10 acres of vineyard, right? So the amount that 10 pairs of oxen could plow in a single day. We don't know the exact amount that would be, but they said roughly an acre according to their the translation, just to make sense to us, right? It's a fair amount of land. The amount that 10 pair of oxen could plow in a single day, it will yield but 1 bath. A bath is a liquid measure of approximately 6 gallons, right? So despite 10 pairs of oxen plowing all these fields in a day, like that's a pretty big portion of field, it will only produce 6 gallons of wine, right? That's what it's talking about there. 6 gallons. That's it. Not very good. Not a very big turnaround, right? I mean, you've got all this land, 10 acres of land, 10 yokes of land, yet only 1 bath. Yikes. And a homer of seed shall yield but an ephah. A homer, that literally means donkey load. That's the amount that a donkey can carry, and that's approximately 10 ephahs. An ephah is a dry measure of grain equal to a bath, which is 22 liters, right? So bath, that is the liquid measurement, and ephah is the dry measurement, right? So we have like for wine or for grain, bath, they're equivalent though, right? Both are about 6 gallons or 22 liters. But bath is the liquid measurement, ephah is the dry measurement there. And so you have a homer, which is equal to 10 ephahs. So a homer of seed shall produce but 1 ephah. That's backwards, right? Once again, typically if you plant a seed, you're expecting to receive approximately 10 times the return for that one seed, right? You plant one seed, boom, you get 10 times the return. Instead, we have God totally reversing this. You will plant a homer, which is 10 times the size of an ephah, but you'll only receive an ephah in return. This is famine-like conditions. Because of their sin, God is vowing to flip the ratios of their productivity, reducing their land to famine-like conditions. That's what God is saying will come upon these people because they've been so greedy, because they've been so focused on their own wealth and their own prosperity and their own possessions. God says that he will take things out of their own control. They think they're in control right now, right? They think that they can acquire more houses and more land, that the more land they have, the better off they are. But God says no. You can have as much land as you want, but I'm going to make it so that it means nothing to you because you're going to put in all the work, but you're going to receive very return for your labor. I think that you see some spiritual application in this nowadays, where we live in a very materialistic society where people are very focused on their own possessions, but as they go about these things, I think there's less satisfaction that comes from them, right? The more you pursue materialism, the less satisfied you are in the return of your efforts. And so I think that there is a kind of spiritual application of this. It's not the direct application here because this is talking very physically, but I think we can see that in our own lives. Then we get to the second woe, which is directed against drunkards and hedonists. And he says this, "Woe to those who rise early in the morning that they may run after strong drink, who tarry late into the evening as wine inflames them. They have lyre and harp, tambourine and flute and wine at their feasts, but they do not regard the deeds of the Lord or see the work of his hands." So right here we just have the description of these people, and we're going to get in a second to what's going to happen to them. But they rise early in the morning that they may run after strong drink. You know, these are the people who wake up in the morning and the first thing they want is an alcoholic beverage. They're thinking, it's 5 o'clock somewhere. That's their mentality, right? They wake up and they're drinking. And they run and they tarry late in the evening as wine inflames them. So from morning to evening, all they're doing is drinking alcohol, getting drunk. These people are just living off of pleasure and kind of this mindless escapism. They have no moments of sobriety in their life because all they're doing is pursuing pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. That's what hedonism is. If you don't know what the word hedonism means, it just means the pursuit of pleasure, right? It's a person who pursues pleasure for a living. These people, they have lyre and harp, tambourine and flute and wine at their feasts, but they do not regard the deeds of the Lord or see the work of his hands. These people know how to have a good time and enjoy life in the moment, but they're avoiding the things that really matter. Right? These people, they've got their lyres, they've got their harps, they're playing their instruments, they have tambourine and flute and wine at their feasts. They go to all the parties, they are having what would be considered a good time in life. Typically, whenever people talk about having fun, these people are the ones at the center of attention. These are the people who are there, they have all the instruments, they know how to laugh, they know how to have a good time, they know how to drink, they know how to party it up. That's who these people are. But they do not regard the deeds of the Lord or see the work of his hands. So they know how to have a good time, but they don't know how to do what's right because they don't ever actually take the time to consider what's right. They're so focused on the pursuit of pleasure that they have very few moments of sober-minded thinking where they actually considered, what should I be doing with my life? What am I doing with my life? What does God want me to do with my life? I think we see a lot of people like this nowadays in American culture and in cultures all around the world. I think this is something that's a very severe issue, and I think it's very easy to get wrapped up into because the pursuit of pleasure is a very desirable thing. You're literally pursuing pleasure. You're pursuing the things that make you feel good. And so I think that's very tempting to do, but in doing so, you distract yourself from God and you fail to look at the things that he's done in the world around us. So this is what God says to them. "Therefore my people go into exile for lack of knowledge. Their honored men go hungry, and their multitude is parched with thirst." So he says, okay, well, because you failed to consider the word of the Lord, and because you failed to listen to me, you're going to go into exile, and you're not even going to understand why. Because you were literally living for yourself this entire time. You're going into exile without knowledge. You won't even understand why you're being sent away because you never actually listened to my words. You never actually listened to what the prophets were saying. "Their honored men go hungry, their multitude are parched with thirst." You are filling up your bellies and you are filling up You were drinking all the wine and you were filling up your bellies with bread, but now everybody's going to be hungry and thirsty because they're going off into exile where there will be no pleasure to be found. Therefore Sheol has enlarged its appetite and opened its mouth beyond measure, and the nobility of Jerusalem and her multitude will go down, her revelers, and he who exults in her. Sheol is the Hebrew concept of the place of the dead, or the underworld. It didn't necessarily have a positive or negative connotation like we have for like heaven or hell. It's just Sheol, the underworld, death. In this instance, it's being personified as a ravenous monster ready to receive its victims, right? So Sheol, death, has enlarged its appetite and opened its mouth beyond measure. Death itself is opening its mouth ready to consume the people of Judah because of their pursuit of pleasure. And the nobility of Jerusalem and her multitude will go down, her revelers and he who exults in her. So all the nobles of Jerusalem who have been having all these parties, who've been drinking all this wine, who have been living for their own pleasure, they're going to go into exile and they're going to die in sin. They're going to die in their exile. Sheol's going to eat them up. Verse 15, man is humbled and each one is brought low, and the eyes of the haughty are brought low. I've emphasized multiple times in this study, and I'm going to emphasize it the whole way through. Isaiah is a book about pride and humility. The humble will be exalted, the proud will be humbled. But God alone will be exalted. And so Isaiah says, man is humbled, and each one is brought low. The eyes of the haughty are brought low. You thought you could live your entire life for pleasure. You thought that you could pursue all these different pleasures and you'd be totally fine and totally happy. But what about that moment whenever all those things are taken away from you and you have no option, but you're forced to face the reality of life? That's what's coming towards these hedonists. That's what's coming towards these drunkards. There's going to be a time where they're not going to have any more wine to dull their senses. They're not going to have any more parties. They're not going to have any more instruments to distract their minds. They're going to be taken into captivity, and they're going to have to face their actions. And they're going to have to face the harsh reality of the fact that they disregarded the word of the Lord, and that's why they're in captivity, and they're going to die there. And therefore, they're going to be humbled. And unfortunately, there are many people in this life right here now who are going to face the same thing. They might face it in this life, but ultimately we know that all of us will one day stand before the judgment seat of God. And every one of us is going to have to give an account for our actions. And some people are going to be really shocked because they spent their entire life pursuing pleasure and not even considering God or considering his will. And they're going to have to stand before him. And they're going to have to face the harsh reality that there was a God who was worth loving. That's not even the worst part, right? It's not like he's like a bad God. They're going to have to stand before him and realize that he's the most amazing thing, and that their lives would have been so much happier and more joyful if they had just bowed down to him. And they're going to have to stand before him, and they're going to have to realize that judgment's awaiting them because they lived for themselves and not for God. And that's going to be a humbling moment. Man is humbled and each one is brought low, and the eyes of the haughty are brought low. But the Lord of hosts is exalted in justice, and the holy God shows himself holy in righteousness, right? So the things that he looked for in the people of Judah, he looked for justice and he looked for righteousness, but they didn't have it. But God will be exalted in that day because he is just and he is righteous. And so they'll be humbled because all they were filled with were iniquity and riots, but he will be exalted because he is filled with equity and what's right. So God has the things that Judah was supposed to have. And so he will be exalted, but they will be brought low. The Lord of hosts will be exalted that day, and he will show himself holy. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about the word holy next week. Then shall the lambs graze as in their pasture, and nomad shall eat among the ruins of the rich. So once the people are exiled, at long last, you almost have this imagery of the land finally receiving rest. While these people are being tormented, while they're marched away, while they are being punished for their sins, at long last the land will receive rest, and at long last the poor people and the nomads, the people who had no home, at long last they'll enjoy some luxury, because all the people who were oppressing them and who were living for their own pleasure will be gone. At long last the lambs will finally be able to graze in their pasture, because nobody's going to be occupying the land and chewing them off. The nomads shall eat among the ruins of the rich, because the rich are gone and they left a lot behind. And so at long last, the land gets rest because their oppressors are gone. Then we get to the third woe, verses 18 and 19. This one's directed against those who actively defy God. Woe to those who draw iniquity with the cords of falsehood, who draw sin as with cart ropes, who say, let him be quick, let him speed his work that we may see it. Let the counsel of the Holy One of Israel draw near, and let it come that we may know it. You can hear the sarcasm in their voice as they say that. So this is directed against those who they're just living in absolute rebellion against God. These are the people who, they consider the ways of God, and they mock him, right? That's who these people are. You might know people like this. This is the internet atheist, right? The internet skeptic who they definitely consider God, and they might have even studied the Bible, but they just mock him and don't take him seriously at all. That's what these people are. Woe to those who draw iniquity with cords of falsehood, who draw sin as with cart ropes. I have a note here. One draws after them that which they possess. The only thing Isaiah's audience could claim possession of was sin, right? It's the imagery of as they're going off in exile, right? You can imagine them walking off into exile. And whenever you're going off into exile, you're taking with you all that you've got, right? You've got a cart behind you, and you've got a rope that you're dragging the cart with. That's what you own. It's what you possess. The only things that these people own, it's cords of falsehood, drawing iniquity. They're drawing sin as with cart ropes, right? They don't have any donkeys to pull the carts. They have to pull it themselves. And the only thing that they've got is sin. That's what they claim possession of, because that's all they know how to do. They live for sin. They live purely to make other people miserable. They live only to mock God. And this is what those people say. Let him be quick. Let him speed his work that we may see it. Let the counsel of the Holy One of Israel draw near, and let it come that we may know it. What they're doing is they're mocking Isaiah, right? Isaiah's been saying judgment is coming soon. Judgment is coming soon. Judgment is coming soon. And these people say, we'll believe it when we see it, right? You keep saying judgment's coming soon, Isaiah. Well, where's the judgment? I don't see anybody coming in and sending us into exile. Let him be quick. Let him speed his work that we may see it. If God's going to judge us, bring it on. Let's see his work. Let the counsel of the Holy One of Israel draw near, and let it come that we may know it. Yeah, Isaiah, we'll believe he's exiling us when we see it. We don't buy it. We think we're fine with God. We think we're good. Yeah, all we do is sin, but we're the holy people of God. He's not going to do anything to us. That's what these people's mentality is. Unfortunately, there's people like this nowadays as well, right? But what we have to realize is that God is just being patient. I mean, you have people nowadays who will mock the idea that Jesus is going to return, right? Oh, I'll believe it when I see it. Well, when you see it, it's going to be a little too late for you, buddy. It's better to believe now, right? You shouldn't want to see God's judgment. Rather, you should believe in him because he is God. He's true. He's loving. He's wonderful. But these people are just mocking Isaiah, and they're saying, yeah, we'll believe it when we see it. Unfortunately, there's people like that nowadays, and all we can do is try to minister to them and try to call them to see the truth. Fourth woe. It's against those who think that they define what is good and evil. This is really the heart of all sin. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. These people blur moral issues. They justify sin and make it look more desirable than doing what is right. This is a hard one, honestly, because I think that if you think that you are not guilty of this, you probably need to check your heart a little bit more, because I know I'm guilty of this. I think we're probably all guilty of all this. I know I've pursued pleasure. I know that I'm probably guilty of every single thing that's done here, but we need to be aware of that and make sure that we're not living in that. But yeah, I've definitely done this. Call evil good, good evil. With great power comes great responsibility. The more you know about the Bible, the better. But also, the more you know about the Bible, the easier it is to justify sin, because you can take bits and pieces of what the Bible says and you can twist it for your own personal gain, and that's a scary reality. And so you have a lot of people they have a lot of knowledge, and with a lot of knowledge comes a lot of responsibility, because you can twist things and you can make evil things look really good, and you can make good things look really evil. You can shine light in the midst of the darkness, but it's a false sense of light, and you can make people think they're seeing light, but really they're not. They put darkness for light and light for darkness. They put bitter for sweet, sweet for bitter. These people, they flip everything on its head. They know how to blur the moral lines. This is the definition of postmodern society. The society we live in right now, that is the definition of all this stuff, right? Love is love, they say. Yeah, but they mean two different things. Whenever they say love one way and they say love the other way, they mean two different things. Because that's just how it is. You wouldn't have to say love is love if you meant the same thing by both of those terms. You only have to say it if they mean two different things. But they'll blur it all together, right? Oh no, God's fine with whatever. He doesn't care about, you don't have to talk about sin. You don't have to talk about that stuff. God loves you. But we do need to talk about it. There is a certain morality that God believes in, and because he is the creator of the universe, we owe it to him to listen to him and to obey him. And so we don't want to blur these moral issues. Yes, there are difficult things we have to wrestle through. Yes, there is some gray area, but there are some things God has made black and white that we don't want to blur. These people know how to justify sin. They know how to make sin look desirable. They know how to fulfill the role of the serpent in the Garden of Eden who says, did God really say that? Oh no, don't take that seriously. God's just afraid that you're going to do this. People know how to do that. I'm afraid that I see this in myself sometimes. Whenever I desire to do something, I find myself justifying it in my mind, and I might even use scripture to justify it, which is scary. But that's exactly what the devil did whenever he was tempting Jesus. He tried to use scripture to justify sin. And that's why we need to know scripture in its proper context, and that's why we need to be able to combat that. Because the devil's going to come after us, and we're going to come after ourselves. We do this very thing. And Isaiah says, woe to those people who do that, because that's why the people are going to be sent into exile. The fifth woe is against the proud. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and shrewd in their own sight. These people presume that they know better than everybody else, including God, and they only listen to their own judgment. They're wise in their own eyes. They're shrewd in their own sight. These people, they don't listen to outside knowledge. They don't listen to outside information. They don't listen to outside feedback. They talk more than they listen. And they definitely don't listen to God. They think that they can figure out the difference between good and evil on their own, right? This is a sin that goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. God said, that is evil. Don't eat from that tree. Don't eat from that food. It is foolish to eat from that fruit. And what does the woman do? She looks and she says, ooh, it's desirable to make one wise. Is it though? No, she was being wise in her own eyes. God said, don't do it, and therefore it would be foolish to do it. But she said it's desirable to make one wise. Well, I don't think so. No, I think that it's desirable to make one foolish, because if you eat it, you're going to be a fool because you're doing the opposite of what God says. But she was being wise in her own eyes. And that's what we do every time we sin. We are being wise in our own eyes. We're being shrewd in our own sight. We're saying to God, yes, God, I know that you told me to do this, but I'd rather listen to myself. I'd rather do my own thing. That's what we do. And so I don't want us to just look at the people of Judah and say, oh my gosh, these people are terrible. We have to realize that we're guilty of the exact same things that they did. And we need to listen to this stuff just as much, because we're hearing the heart of God being spoken through Isaiah right now. God is saying, woe to those people. And that means that God doesn't want us to do it. The sixth and final woe, verses 22 to 23, is directed against those who deal in injustice. Woe to those who are heroes at drinking wine, and valiant men in mixing strong drink, who acquit the guilty for a bribe and deprive the innocent of his right. Here we have Isaiah calling these people heroes at drinking wine and valiant men in mixing strong drink. We once again return to the imagery of drunkards. But it's ironic that he calls them heroes and valiant men, because these are titles of military achievement. Such people are accomplished in sinfulness, right? This is a term of prestige. Yes, they're heroes. Yes, they're valiant men. What is their accomplishment? Sin, right? Drinking wine, mixing strong drink. Their greatest accomplishment is leading people astray. They are experts at indulging themselves, even at the expense of others, and the perversion of justice. These people, their greatest accomplishment is drinking wine, mixing strong drink. They acquit the guilty for a bribe, right? They'll let bad people go away just so they get paid the right money. And they deprive the innocent of his right. So the guilty people, they let them go away if they get money for it. But then innocent people, they will deprive them of the right, because the innocent person, they deserve to have the guilty punished, right? But then the innocent person, they end up getting judged because the guilty person has been set free, right? So no justice is being done here. And that's because these people are just self-indulgent. They're just looking to their own needs. And once again, I think we do this. Whenever we show favoritism to somebody, I know that seems like a much less important thing, but that's what we're doing here. We're being unjust, and we're actually dealing in a very self-indulgent manner. We're showing favoritism to one person because of what they offer to us. Even consider this. This is not directly what this is about, but even consider your friendships. Nowadays, the way that friendships work, both platonic and romantic, right? All sorts of relationships that we have with other individuals, typically we have created those in such a manner that they are more of a self-indulgent system where we only hang out with our friends whenever we need something from them. You won't hear from somebody for a long time, and then all of a sudden they'll message you because they need something from you. Right? That's what this is talking about right here, right? These people are totally self-indulgent. They're only doing what benefits them. They're heroes, they're valiant men, but that's because they're just really accomplished in drinking wine and mixing strong drink. They're doing what's good for them. They're letting the guilty go because it's good for them. They're depriving the innocent of their right because it's good for them. These people are entirely focused on themselves, and they're willing to be unjust and unfair purely because it benefits themselves. That's what we do whenever we're not being good friends with people. Whenever we only contact distract somebody because we need something from them, we're being unjust, we're being unfair, we're being unloving. I know that's a very minor example, but I'm trying to make this practically applicable to us nowadays. And I think if we look at the smallest example of this, we'll be able to also avoid the more extreme ones, like actually acquitting the guilty for a bribe. That one's explicitly stated right here in the text. I'm trying to address the smaller stuff where this might manifest in our lives, just in the confines of our hearts, right? That's what I want to address. And I want us to realize that we are just as guilty of a lot of these things. And so these are the 6 woes being directed against the people of Judah. We see that these people are materialists, they're partiers, they're rebellious, they're subjectivists, they're arrogant, and they're unjust. In other words, the people of Judah were exactly like our culture nowadays. Unfortunately, they also had a lot of resemblances to our church culture nowadays, which scares me. And I think we really need to listen up. Because I think that if you look at these 6 different woes, it would not be very difficult to think of somebody in your own church who practices these different things. And before you point the finger at them, look at yourself and look at your own heart and say, am I guilty of these same things? Because God obviously does not approve of these things. So what should we do? What is God's response going to be to this? What is God going to do to these people? He keeps saying, woe to you, woe to you, woe to you. Why does he say woe to you? Well, that leads us to our final section, verses 24 through 30 of this chapter, where God's going to explain why he's been saying woe to you. Because he's going to tell them destruction is coming. I've titled this last section Yahweh's Vengeance, because that is exactly what God's going to do. They might deprive other people of justice, but he's going to be just. And if they are living in sin, he's going to bring forth vengeance. And that's what he promises in these final verses. Therefore, as the tongue of fire devours the stubble, and as dry grass sinks down in the flames, so their root will be as rottenness, and their blossom go up like dust. For they have rejected the law of the Lord of hosts, and have despised the Holy One of Israel. So God says they are going to be destroyed. That's just what he's saying, right? That's what this entire section's about. They are going to be destroyed. As the tongue of fire devours stubble, as dry grass sinks down in the flames, so their root will be as rottenness, their blossom goes up like dust. The imagery is of the entire land of Judah going up in flames and being reduced to ashes. Why? For they have rejected the law of the Lord of hosts. They have despised the word of the Holy One of Israel. God gave them a law. God planted a vineyard, and he gave them everything they needed to produce good grapes. He gave them 613 laws through the prophet Moses. He gave them all these laws, and he said, this is how you're going to live. You are to be holy as I am holy. You are supposed to live before me in righteousness and in truth and in purity. But they didn't do it. They've rejected the law. They're living for themselves. They're living in a material fashion rather than seeking God. They're being partiers rather than being sober-minded thinkers. They're being rebellious rather than being submissive. They're being subjective rather than being objective. They're being arrogant rather than being humble. They're being unjust rather than being just. He came and he looked for equity, but they produced iniquity. He came looking for what was right, and they produced a riot. They've rejected the law of God. They've rejected everything that he stands for, everything he is about. They've rejected it, and they've despised him. And so he's going to reduce them to ashes. Therefore the anger of the Lord was kindled against his people, and he stretched out his hand against them and struck them. And the mountains quaked, and their corpses were as refuse in the middle of the streets. For all his anger has not turned away, and his hand is stretched out still. This is hard stuff. This is hard to talk about. But this is the anger of the Lord, and it's the just anger of God, right? This is a loving God, and he cares for his people, and he's got a plan. We've talked about that. He's going to bring them back, and he's going to restore them, and he's going to love them, and he's going to send the Messiah. But before then, he's going to strike them. The anger of the Lord was kindled against his people. I like that the word says kindled there, because as we use, this is continuing this metaphor, right? As we saw in the previous verses, God says, I'm going to destroy you with fire. I'm going to burn you down to ashes. And so we have the anger being kindled. Right? I think I haven't looked there, but sometimes the word for anger there in Hebrew, it's the word for nose, and it's the idea of breathing out, or it's like burning, right? It's like whenever you're like, the anger of the Lord was kindled against his people, and he stretched out his hand against them and struck them, and the mountains quaked, and their corpses were as refuse in the midst of the streets. So we see here, I put a note, the people will not even be afforded proper burials. But notice how Isaiah is speaking. He's speaking as though this has already happened. That's the scary part, right? He's speaking of future events as if they've already happened, and that's because he's confident that this day is coming, right? The mountains quaked. Their corpses were as refuse in the midst of the streets. They're just lying there because there's nobody there to bury them. They're just dead from war. For all his anger has not turned away, and his hand is stretched out still. So even though they're going to be taken away, that's not going to abate his anger. He's going to be punishing them for a while. They're going to be in captivity for 70 years before they come back. He will raise a signal for nations far away, and whistle for them from the ends of the earth. And behold, quickly, speedily they come. None is weary, none stumbles, none slumbers or sleeps. Not a waistband is loose, not a sandal strap is broken. Their arrows are sharp, all their bows bent. Their horses' hooves seem like flint, and their wheels like a whirlwind. Right now, he's specifically talking about Assyria and Babylon. As a result of their continued rejection of him, God will send pagan foreign nations to carry his people into exile. Assyria will be a thorn in Judah's side for quite some time. We're going to read about that in the chapters to come as well, specifically starting in chapter 7. But Assyria is not ultimately going to be the cause of Judah's destruction. They're going to destroy the northern kingdom of Israel, but not Judah. Eventually, Babylon's going to come in, and they're going to be the ones who are going to destroy them. And it says right here that God is the one calling them to do so. Isn't that a scary thought? This isn't that, it's not like God was taking a nap and he woke up and was like, oh my gosh, my people have been taken off into captivity. No, God is the one raising the signal. He is calling a pagan and sinful people to come in and judge his people. That's sad. This is actually going to be the question about whenever we get to the book of Habakkuk. That is Habakkuk's question. He's like, God, is that even just? You're using a more sinful people to judge a sinful people? You're using a people of greater sin to judge a people of lesser sin. How does that work? That's going to be the question of Habakkuk when we get there. But right here, we have God raising a signal for nations far away, whistling for them from the ends of the earth. You have God putting his fingers in his mouth, and he's whistling. Right? And he's calling the nations to rise up, gather their armies, and come down to destroy his own people. This is a heartbreaking image. And behold, quickly, speedily they come. And then in the verses that come, 27 and 28, you have this quick speed, there's this quickness and speediness to the actions, right? None is weary, none stumbles, none slumbers or sleeps, not a waistband is loose, not a sandal strap is broken. These people, they hear God calling them to destroy Judah, and that is what they are doing. They get up, and not one of them is weary, right? They're alert, they're awake. Not one of them is stumbling. They are running as fast as they can, and they're not tripping. No one slumbers or sleeps. They're not taking any rest. Not a waistband is loose. They are all armored up. They are ready to go. Not a sandal strap is broken. They don't have anything that's going to prevent them from getting there any slower. They're going to get there quick. Their arrows are sharp. Their weapons are ready. All their bows are bent. They are ready to shoot. Their horses' hooves seem like flint and their wheels like the whirlwind. If you were to look at them, it just looks like they are just traveling across the desert and across the land as quickly as possible to destroy Judah. Yikes. That's the imagery right here. And we see that God is the one initiating this because God disciplines those whom he loves. That is the scary message behind this. But it's also a beautiful message because God loves us. And that means if we live in sin, God might discipline us. He should. Honestly, if you're living in sin and you're not being disciplined, you might need to see whether or not you're truly loving God. Because usually God will discipline his children. A good parent does. And so if you're living in sin and you're not feeling that hand of God being pressed upon you, well, then you might need to start off and say, where am I at with God? Because God will discipline his children. And that's what he's going to do to the people of Judah. Final verses. Their roaring is like a lion. Like young lions they roar. They growl and seize their prey. They carry it off and none can rescue. Isaiah is saying nobody's going to be able to stop this. These people are coming and there's nothing you can do to stop it. They will growl over it on that day. Once again, a reference to the day of the Lord. They will growl over it on that day like the growling of the sea. And if one looks to the land, behold darkness and distress, and the light is darkened by its clouds. At the beginning of this chapter, we had the Lord planting a vineyard on a very fertile hill. But now, at the end of this chapter, if someone looks to the land, they'll find darkness and distress, and the light is darkened by its clouds. Because God is sending a storm of judgment upon the people of Judah, and that's what they're going to face. This marks the end of the word that Isaiah, the son of Amoz, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem, starting in chapter 2, verse 1. He foresaw a future day wherein God's king would reign over his people, but because of Judah's continuous rebellion against God, that future kingdom would be delayed by a coming exile. And that's going to ultimately lead us into the New Testament, because God's going to, he says the king's coming, but first there's going to be an exile. People are going to go into exile. They're going to come back. Then there's going to be 400 years of silence, and the king's finally going to show up in the Gospel of Matthew. And so in conclusion to this whole section, I just wanted to kind of end on a more positive note. And you might look at this passage over here I have in this white box, and you might be like, how is that more positive? But let me explain. God isn't being unfair to the people of Judah. He's not being overly harsh. God is being true to his word. And he's doing to them exactly what he said he was going to do. So it's not like these people have it's not like they were living in sin and they're like, whoa, God, where is this coming from? We didn't realize that you took stuff that seriously. No, they knew from the beginning, and they still chose to sin. In Deuteronomy chapter 28, Moses was talking to the people, and he told them exactly what would happen if they lived in sin. He says, "But if you will not obey the voice of the Lord your God, or be careful to do all his commandments and his statutes that I command you today, then all these curses shall come upon you and overtake you." And then over the rest of this chapter, he starts laying out the different things that will happen to them if they don't listen to what God says and if they don't obey his law. Starting in verse 36, we start hearing about stuff that sounds very eerily similar to what we read about today. "The Lord will bring you and your king whom you set over you to a nation that neither you nor your fathers have known." What's interesting is that Moses told them that they weren't supposed to have a king. He told them that God's supposed to be their king. And so it's ironic because Moses already anticipates the fact that they're going to disobey, because he says that he's going to bring you and your king whom you set over you. He knows that they're going to do it. "The Lord will bring you and your king whom you set over you to a nation that neither you nor your fathers have known. And there you shall serve other gods of wood and stone. And you shall become a horror, a proverb, and a byword among all the peoples where the Lord will lead you away. You shall carry much seed into the field, and shall gather in little, for the locust shall consume it. You shall plant vineyards and dress them, but you shall neither drink of the wine nor gather the grapes, for the worm shall eat them. You shall have olive trees throughout all your territory, but you shall not anoint yourself with oil, for your olives shall drop off. You shall father sons and daughters, but they shall not be yours, for they shall go into captivity." So this is exactly what Moses told the people was going to come. He said if they rejected the law of the Lord, they would be sent into captivity. And there in captivity, they would die. They would have sons and daughters, and they would be in captivity too. That's exactly what's going to happen. So this is not coming out of nowhere. It's not like God is blindsiding them with this. For hundreds of years, they have known that this would come. But they chose to sin. And so my encouragement to you would be, do you fall into this category? Are you living like these people right here? I know that I do the same thing, and so I have to constantly draw myself to repentance, constantly humble myself, constantly lay myself down at the feet of the cross of Christ and lay my poverty with it and say, God, forgive me. I don't want to be like this anymore. I want to live for you. I want to give everything to you. I would challenge you and say, are you repenting? Or are you continuing to live this way? Because I don't know how God is specifically going to work in your life. We don't exactly relate to God in the same way the people of Judah did. We are not people who relate to God according to the law, right? We relate to him a little bit differently. We have the Spirit of God dwelling inside of us. I get that that's different. But that doesn't mean that God takes our sin any less seriously. If anything, I would say that he takes it even more seriously, because now we are in and of ourselves, as Christians, temples of the living God. And so I would encourage you, dear Christian, check your heart. Check yourself before you wreck yourself. Look at yourself and see if these things in this chapter apply to you. Before you start accusing other people of it, check yourself, right? That's what Jesus says, right? Judge not lest ye be judged. He's not saying don't judge. He's saying that the same measure you pour out on others will be poured back on you. And so if you're going to judge somebody else, you need to judge yourself first. Look at your own heart. See if this stuff applies to you. And if so, please repent, because I don't know if it's going to happen in this life or if it's going to be in the end of days when you stand before God. But at some point, you're going to have to answer to God for your actions. And if you are living in this way, and if you are living in sin, God is not going to be happy. And I want to tell you that there is hope. Because like I said, Isaiah promised in this section that there is going to be a king that comes to make all things right. If you go back to Isaiah chapter 1, he said that if you repent, God will take your scarlet sins and make them as white as snow. And so if you find yourself living in such a state, I want to remind you that there is hope found. Because we do know the person that Isaiah talked about. We know his name is Jesus Christ. He showed up 2,000 years ago, and I want you to remember that hope is found in him. Place your faith in him, repent, turn away from your old ways, and live for him. Not because doing the actions saves you, but because he is worthy to be served, and he's worthy to be praised. I pray that you'll take that, you'll apply it. And with that being said, we're going to wrap up today's message. Next week, we're going to be talking about the call of Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 6. And I'm really excited for that because we're only going through one chapter, and it's a short chapter, which means we'll actually be able to go in depth, and probably as in depth as I typically would like to go. I feel like I'm rushing through all this other stuff, but I'm actually going to be able to go somewhat in depth in Isaiah chapter 6. And I wanted to just spend time on this one chapter because I think it's so crucial, and I didn't want to rush through it. And so thank you so much for watching this video. Once again, if you joined my Patreon, thank you so much. If you didn't join my Patreon, that's also fine. Thank you for watching this video. Thank you for making this far. Be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, leave a comment below, introduce yourself to me, say something about the video. I don't know. I'd love to get to meet you. I try to reply to all these. I know I still need to catch up on commenting back to some of my previous videos. I haven't really had time to go through those, but thank you so much for watching these. I appreciate y'all. I can't wait to go through the next one. Isaiah chapter 6 is probably one of my favorite chapters in Isaiah. So until then, be sure to keep a smile on your face. Don't let anybody steal your joy. Once again, my name is David Tate. This is Now Let's Be Honest. I'll see y'all next time.
You read a verse, you sing a hymn, the money's in the plate. Sundays you mark out for him, but even then you show up late. You bought the shirt, you wear the cross, but sin throughout the week. For 30 shekels and a noose, you kiss him on the cheek.